about difficult situations in ministry and try to get practical with it. We want to come out of the conversation of conflict and narrow down a little bit more to talk about the specific situation of church discipline. Now, let me give you a little bit of a caveat. I know that we will not be able to cover every potential scenario that'll happen in ministry and give you all the details of how you should handle every single scenario. In fact, I don't know that any two scenarios are alike. And so often in ministry, scenarios pop up where you're like, wow, I've not seen this before, and yet I have. So what we want to do is get to some of the core values and core concepts regarding church discipline and give you some tools to use with discernment in those individual scenarios. So I hope that makes sense. In doing so, we want to come to 1 Timothy and talk about some of the dynamics in 1 Timothy, because I think for us, it's a healthy foundation. Paul in that letter is concerned about the healthy church, the health of a church, specifically a church in Ephesus. And there's a threat. The threat are individuals who are teaching what is false, but also doing some things that are in alignment with what is false. And Paul wants Timothy to confront them, to carry out church discipline, to enter into a difficult circumstance. And so there's some principles in that letter that I think become a helpful paradigm for us to use in discernment with the various scenarios that might actually play out in our individual ministry context. It might not be Ephesus, but at the same time, these principles become helpful tools for us. So that's what I want to introduce you to. I also want us to recognize that it's not just in 1 Timothy we find these principles. Oftentimes we turn to Matthew chapter 18. You can go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 14. You can turn over to the Corinthian correspondence, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and find some of these same principles. So I don't want to make this an exhaustive New Testament investigation of church discipline, but I have tried to boil it down and use 1 Timothy as kind of the starting point, and let all of those other passages then speak into some of the things that we're going to talk about. So foundational principle number one, here's what I want to say. Church discipline must be done in the context of a covenantal relationship. And this makes sense, right? At some level, we don't carry out church discipline to those outside the church. It doesn't make sense. First of all, it's church discipline. Second of all, how do you discipline someone who's not a part of you? It would be wrong of me to discipline someone else's kid. They're not part of my covenantal community, my family. And so church discipline is done to those in your church. That said, I think there's a principle here that we need to drill down even a little bit deeper on. Discipline is best done in the context of relationship, specifically covenantal relationship. Maybe I could define it as discipling relationships. One of the reasons we struggle with church discipline is we actually at times don't have strong relationships with the people who even attend our church. We've not actually entered into a discipling relationship with those individuals. So if we've not discipled them, how can we discipline them? Those two words, by the way, have similar etymology, obviously. The discipling is teaching people to become more like Christ, and disciplining them is to, disciple them to become more like Christ. And so at some level, if we fail at discipling, we're really going to flounder at the role of discipline as well. In fact, it's going to come out of nowhere. And so that becomes an important question mark on kind of the front end of this entire paradigm. Is part of the reason we struggle with church discipline because we're failing to actually enter into discipling relationships with people that are based in covenant, where they have communicated their desire to follow Jesus, and we have communicated the covenantal desire to lead them closer to Jesus, and therefore we have the right to hold them accountable when they're not doing that. Perhaps there's some practical things that can come out of that when it comes to how we're discipling individuals. That being said, discipleship is always motivated by some core motivational factors. Number one, discipleship is motivated out of a desire to disciple. We've kind of already dealt with that. Number two, discipline, church discipline, is always motivated out of love for the individual, as well as for the church, as well as for Christ. Now notice the motivation here. The motivation is discipleship of the individual, discipleship of the community toward Christ, and it's motivated out of love for the individual, for the church, for Christ, and by extension, for the world around us, for the sake of the witness of the world around us. Paul says this in chapter 1 of 1 Timothy. Notice what he says. He says, Timothy, when I'm leaving you in Ephesus, and I need you to give this charge to certain people. These people are going to be disciplined by Timothy. I need you to charge them not to teach anymore, specifically this other doctrine that they're teaching. But Timothy, I want you to know that the motivation, the end goal, the aim of this charge is, notice the motivation there, is love. This is my motivation. And so if you're not able to, in whatever scenarios play out, answer these two questions. Are you motivated out of a desire to disciple the individual and disciple the people in your church? Yes or no? And two, are you motivated out of love for the individual, love for the people in your church, love for Christ, and love for the community, the witness to the world around you? If you can't answer yes to all of those, you're not ready to carry out church discipline. If church discipline is happening out of anger or retribution, out of wrath or out of gossip, then none of those things could be affirmative. So we need to come back to evaluate notice how this happens. We actually are evaluating ourselves first before we're going and evaluating someone else. In this particular passage then, as we move through chapter 1, Paul's going to continue. Now, we're going to deal with some of the context in between. He's going to continue to the place where eventually he's going to say, Timothy, I've actually handed some of these who have been teaching what is false over to Satan. Now, we can get into the theology of this and even kind of the Jewish background behind this phrase. But Paul says, at some level, I've handed these individuals who have been teaching what is false over to Satan's domain. They've actually gone so far that they're no longer following Jesus. In chapter 4, Paul's going to talk about those who are persistent in sin. Rather than being persistent in discipleship, they're persistent in sin. And in doing so, Paul says, they're not really following Jesus anymore. And so I've just recognized where they really are. Now, you know this. A person is either following Jesus or not. But we are not perfect in following Jesus. The trajectory is just consistent or persistent. So we can also then be persistent in not following Jesus and be moving in the opposite direction. This is not falling in and out of salvation. This is not merely having a sin that we are tempted by that traps us or captures us. But this is actually being ensnared and walking in an opposite direction. In essence, breaking the covenant that we have with Jesus. But Paul says, I've handed them over to Satan for a purpose. Again, here's part of the motivation. Here's my purpose, so that they may, notice the motivation of love and discipleship here, so that they may learn. The motivation still here is discipleship. I've handed them over to Satan so that they can actually learn and become disciples of Jesus. In fact, I've handed them over so that they may learn not to blaspheme. Now, I want you to see that what becomes important is Paul has actually just told his testimony, and he actually says this, formerly I was a blasphemer. Paul's motivation is out of love, and his very testimony shares that. He says, but I was given mercy. Paul says, I see them the same way I saw myself when I needed mercy. Formerly I was a blasphemer. Formerly I was against the church. But Christ's mercy came, and he made me, notice what Paul says, the perfect example of his patience for all of those who were to believe. So Paul's motivation here is motivated not only out of love, but out of humility. He knows that he doesn't deserve the mercy or grace of Jesus, but it's only in Jesus that we find this mercy and grace that leads us to the place of salvation. So Paul here, even in the most extreme form of church discipline, which we'll get to in just a minute, which I think we at times have labeled excommunication. It's distancing someone, recognizing they're no longer a part of the community of disciples. They're no longer following Jesus. So they're now part of the world that Satan has dominion over, rather than the community that aligns itself in allegiance to Jesus. Paul says this is the extreme. Those are the passages that do that, that say that. In Titus, he's going to say, hey, have nothing to do with them. Jesus is going to say, treat them as a tax collector or sinner. They're outsiders. But in all of those, the motivation is love. The purpose is discipleship. And the goal is to bring them back. Notice, so that they may learn not to blaspheme. The motivation is always reconciliation, always restorative, always the gospel. And I need you to hear this in principle, that these principles really do build a foundation for us of self-motivation for carrying out church discipline. Now, there's some other practical things we can say as we move through 1 Timothy. In fact, as we scroll down through 1 Timothy and we come to chapter 4, we actually do come through some of these same themes of the false teachers, bringing us into chapter 5. And so let me be clear on our reference. As we get down to chapter 5, we come to an example, I think is still an extension of Paul's discipline of these false teachers, and specifically those who are likely teachers in the church or elders. And Paul says, sometimes when you have elders who have a charge against them, make sure that the charge is dealt with in a just way. Remember the Old Testament talking about 2 or 3 witnesses? So make sure that this is done in a just way, that whatever charge is against them, that you have legitimate reason for why church discipline is being carried out. We see this in Matthew 18 as well. And notice that this church discipline then is done for those who are persistent in sin. This is not a one-time occurrence, but this is something that keeps going. That's not to say that you don't confront someone in a way that keeps them accountable who has a sin in their life. But this is actually bringing this to kind of the logical conclusion of church discipline. So they're persisting in sin. What do we do at that point? Well, we rebuke them. Notice these are public leaders. So the discipline is more public. And so you do this because they're leaders in the presence of all. It's not necessarily the practical application that we would have for everyone. But we do this because of the fact that they were leaders, so that we can show that everyone else who are disciples, this is not what discipleship looks like. But we do it out of the motivation of, notice again, recognizing we stand before the presence of God, justice, that God is ultimately the one who knows and sees all things. Therefore, we want to be like him. We want to do it without prejudging the person. You're guilty. without really knowing the truth. Nor do we want to do this with partiality. You're innocent without actually knowing the truth. So all of this becomes helpful as a paradigm for us. One of the things I want us to observe is, once again, it's important for us to carry out church discipline out of a concern for discipleship of the individual, of the community, and out of a greater level of concern of a witness to the greater world. But we want to do it with motivations that are pure, with justice that is in place, and we want to do it with, I'm going to now unpack for you a range of tools at our disposal. In 1 Timothy, the handing over to Satan and even here the rebuke are kind of at the end of a process. Now, Paul's at the end of a process in this letter. We actually see him build, again, the beginning parts of church discipline, or the preventative parts of church discipline in 1 Timothy. Here's some examples. To prevent the need for church discipline, Paul's going to say, I want you to appoint healthy leaders who are above reproach, who are able to teach others and discipline others. So part of the preventative is actually healthy discipleship. Paul's going to say the same kind of a thing here in chapter 5, where he actually says, hey, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. Don't be hasty or early or quick to make people leaders. But instead, I want you to put the right people in leadership to prevent some of these issues, to prevent some of the need for this. So we recognize that in 1 Timothy, there's a range of tools. At the beginning, part of that range is the tool of putting in healthy teachers and healthy teachings so that people know what is right or wrong. Then we actually get to the place of like, okay, so all scripture is useful and for not only teaching and training, but also then at some point when the line is crossed, rebuking and correcting. So the word of God then becomes helpful for confrontation, perhaps like Matthew 18, one-on-one confrontation. We've not yet gotten perhaps to the place of persistent sin like we see in 1 Timothy 5, or where someone is actually in the domain of walking after Satan more than discipleship of Jesus. But it's just they need training, they need maturing. Okay, so go to them and correct them and steer them. But they've not yet wandered away or shipwrecked their faith. So do we intentionally then, here's a practical step, do we intentionally enter into difficult conversations early on in the process before someone wanders away? Let me give you this illustration that I sometimes do on a whiteboard in my class. Let's take an individual and let's just kind of identify them by this dot on the screen. The false teachers in 1 Timothy are kind of a long ways on this process. They've gotten to the place where they have shipwrecked their faith. They have crossed over to a place where now they are actually captives of the enemy, doing his will. All of these are images that Paul uses in the pastoral epistles. But they've wandered so far away that they're no longer following Jesus. In some ways, they've divorced the covenant of discipleship. But an individual who is walking toward Christ may actually, at some point early in this process, be corrected or trained or re-steered back onto a trajectory toward Jesus. Healthy church discipline is actually best done in this early preventative component of discipleship. This would be true of parenting as well. The best parenting is actually done early in the life of a child or a student. And so I want us to recognize there's a range of tools and a range of church discipline that needs to take place. And likely the majority of your church discipline is more subtle and everyday as you are walking with individuals in this process, pulling them alongside. But here we have an individual, the sheep that has wandered away, that Paul is saying, hey, hopefully this correction can actually, as you rebuke them in the presence of all in their persistent sin, actually spare them this eternal consequence of shipwrecking their faith. And they might actually learn not to blaspheme and actually have a corrected trajectory toward Christ again. And Paul says, hey, by the way, that's my story. I was walking toward Damascus and Jesus blinded me, and I recognized I was actually blind and I needed to change my path and change my trajectory. And Paul ends up following the way. This range of church discipline that Paul gives us is one of the more practical things that I can unpack for you in about 20 minutes, is that this becomes something that we can actually start to fold into our discipleship and our everyday processes. But I do know this, there are some extreme circumstances, some extreme scenarios. One of those is actually a scenario that I want to talk about briefly. And the scenario is this: someone who has sinned to the point in persistent sin to where they can for some reason no longer be an everyday part of the community, and we can't necessarily disciple them while at the same time protect or love our community. Those kinds of things can happen. And so one of the things that becomes important for you to recognize is that at that point it does become costly for you as the person committed to discipleship to disciple them. There may be a reason why an individual should not attend the public worship gathering, and yet you are still called to, like a wandering sheep, be the shepherd who ministers to them and brings them into a community, even if it's not the public community. The motivation here is a motivation of the good shepherd who is always looking after the one and looking to bring them into a relationship with the ultimate good shepherd. And so I'm going to just encourage you, you're going to need discernment in those cases. I can't unpack all of those for you. And so part of that discernment is to enter into other conversations with other discerning leaders who have entered into other conversations and situations like yours. If that's the case, you're walking through a scenario, I don't mind being a starting point for you. Having walked through some of these scenarios personally, but also walking through them with other churches, I don't mind helping you connect some of those dots. My goal here in this introduction for our purposes of the practical ministry course is to start you on this conversation point, give you some healthy tools. So by way of review, as we kind of wrap things up, I think every time we enter into this, we need to check our own motivations. Are we motivated by discipleship for the person, for the greater community of the church, discipleship and our witness for the greater world? Are we motivated by love for the person, for the church, for Christ, for the greater world? Are we using the full range of tools at our disposal? Did we start or fail to start early by training first, healthy, what is healthy, putting healthy leaders in place? Did we fail to correct early in the process by just kind of sweeping some things under the rug or not having relationships and proximity to people? Did we fail in that process of correcting this early and bringing someone back early? And if so, are we now at the place where we need to recognize this person is no longer following Jesus? Do we need to then confront them and acknowledge that fact, but also extend an invitation for them to come and follow Jesus again? So I'm going to encourage you, Solomon is known for being shrewd and discerning, to apply some of these principles we see in the New Testament, whether that be Matthew 18, 1 Timothy, the Corinthians correspondence, in a way that will not allow us to be outwitted by Satan. I love that phrase. In the New Testament as Paul talks about this confrontation of sin, that ultimately we know that Christ's truth will be victorious and that his church will not be defeated. So walk forward in confidence, knowing that these are difficult circumstances, but strive for discernment, strive for love, strive for truth as you carry that out in your various scenarios, as you practice and sometimes fail, but practice church discipline. As we continue this conversation about difficult situations,